Lukas Kotyk is a sociologist and ethnographer whose work centers on social movements, prefigurative politics, and non-hierarchical forms of organization, drawing extensively on long-term fieldwork in squatted and autonomous zones. His dissertation demonstrates methodological depth through 19 months of multi-sited ethnography, combining participant observation, in-depth interviews, and detailed analysis of internal organizational repertoires within free spaces. Kotyk's research emphasizes horizontal power distribution, consensus-based decision-making, and the tensions between autonomy and legalization, with a particular focus on how social movements experiment with alternative social arrangements in daily life. His work is situated within contemporary debates in political anthropology and social movement studies, engaging closely with scholarship on prefiguration, commons, and the squatters movement. This paper looks at how European rainbow gatherings, month-long camps held in remote natural areas, manage to bring together thousands of people without leaders, money, or formal organizations, and still stay peaceful and orderly. The author, who lived at a 2024 European gathering in Germany for 7 weeks, describes Rainbow as a traveling free space where people try to live the world they want to see. Decisions are made in long talking circles where everyone can speak, there is no alcohol, no buying or selling, and all work, from cooking to building toilets, is done voluntarily by whoever steps up as a temporary focalizer. Money is only collected anonymously in a magic hat to buy basics like food and tools, and there is a strong norm against using social media or creating official online pages so no one can gain power by speaking for the movement. By camping illegally in hard-to-reach mountain areas, moving from country to country, and relying on non-violent ways to deal with conflict, the gatherings avoid being shut down and keep power spread out horizontally. The study argues that this long-running experiment shows how people can organize large, complex events without hierarchy, and that simply living this way together for a time is itself a powerful form of quiet, practical political change. Rainbow gatherings started as part of the U.S. anti-war movement in the 1970s, when people were looking for new ways to live out ideas of peace and equality in everyday life instead of just protesting. Over time, this idea crossed the Atlantic and turned into regular European gatherings that can bring together 3,000 to 5,000 people at their peak. The introduction explains that these events are not a side activity to some bigger campaign, they are the central project of the movement, and the gatherings themselves are where people test and practice their beliefs about a more peaceful, equal society. The main purpose of these gatherings is to create autonomous zones, which means temporary communities that follow their own rules instead of the usual rules of mainstream society. Inside these zones, people try to organize everything without bosses, leaders, or formal organizations. Decisions are made using non-hierarchical methods, such as long group discussions where everyone who wants to speak can do so and no one has the final say just because of their status. The goal is that daily life itself becomes a kind of experiment in power sharing and mutual respect, rather than just talking about those values in theory. These events always take place in remote natural areas, usually in the mountains and as far away from towns and villages as possible. This physical distance helps people step outside their normal routines and roles, and it also makes it less likely that local authorities or neighbors will interfere. The timing of the gatherings is tied to the lunar cycle, starting and ending with the new moon and having a major celebration at the full moon halfway through. This gives the meetings a clear rhythm and beginning, middle, and structure, and some people stay much longer than the official dates to help with preparation and cleanup. The gatherings are deliberately kept low profile. They avoid media attention, do not try to influence local politics directly, and usually do not engage in local campaigns or activism. Many of them are technically illegal because they involve camping and building temporary infrastructure on land where such use is not allowed. To make this possible, participants often squat the land, meaning they occupy it without formal permission, and if the police try to evict them they use non-violent, non-confrontational tactics rather than fighting back. The movement treats mobility as a defense, gatherings move from country to country, and ideally they end or relocate before the authorities can fully shut them down. To make sense of these practices, the introduction connects rainbow gatherings to ideas in social movement theory about free spaces and prefigurative politics. Free spaces are small pockets of life where people can organize differently from the mainstream and keep their movements alive over the long term. Prefigurative politics is the idea that movements should start living the kind of society they want to create, here and now, instead of only demanding change from governments or institutions. Rainbow is presented as a powerful example of this, because it merges goals and methods. The peaceful, egalitarian world they imagine is directly reflected in how they cook, meet, decide, and live together during the gatherings. Finally, the introduction points out that, despite their long history and scale, European rainbow gatherings have been largely ignored by social movement research, especially compared to better-known protests and occupations. The study therefore aims to fill this gap by looking closely at the rules, routines, and techniques that allow thousands of people to coexist without formal leaders or money and still keep power from concentrating in a few hands. It is especially interested in how these methods have been repeated and refined over decades, allowing the movement to keep recreating large, horizontal, non-hierarchical events again and again in different places. The non-hierarchical movement section explains how rainbow gatherings work as autonomous zones, meaning places where people agree to live by their own shared rules instead of the usual laws and habits of everyday society. These rules are not imposed from above, they are made and maintained by the participants themselves through discussion and practice. At the heart of these rules is a promise to treat everyone as equal and to avoid violence, both physical and social. The gatherings are set up so that people are encouraged to act responsibly toward each other and the space they share, without needing police, managers, or formal authorities to keep order. The author stresses that the basic principles behind Rainbow have stayed surprisingly stable over decades. From early on, participants agreed on core norms through consensus, and these have been carried forward as the default settings for later gatherings. At the same time, there is an open recognition that daily life never perfectly matches the ideals, conflicts still happen, power imbalances still appear, and the rules are sometimes broken. Rather than pretending everything is ideal, people use these tensions as a way to keep adjusting their behavior and expectations, constantly testing how close they can get to their vision of equality and peace in messy real-world conditions. A key part of the movement's identity is the deliberate avoidance of fixed hierarchies. There are no permanent leaders, no formal committees, and no one person or group that is officially responsible for the whole event. Instead, the gathering is treated as a collective experiment in non-coercive power, where influence comes from participation, experience, and trust rather than titles or positions. People may temporarily take on more responsibility in certain areas, but these roles are always meant to be open, challengeable, and short-lived. The idea is that power should keep circulating rather than settling into a stable hierarchy. The section also explains the very practical limits the movement faces in Europe. To host thousands of people safely, a site needs space for parking, drinking water, firewood, and a large meadow for gatherings, all preferably far from towns to avoid complaints. At the same time, European regulations often do not allow such large, informal camps, especially when they involve open fires and makeshift infrastructure. This forces Rainbow to operate in a legal gray area, choosing remote mountain locations that are hard to police or evict. These choices are not just symbolic, they are tactical responses to how European land use and public order laws work in practice. The relationship to the state and nearby communities is described as cautious and pragmatic. Ideally, the gathering comes and goes without major clashes with authorities or neighbors. Participants put a lot of effort into cleaning up, dismantling structures, and leaving the site looking as if no one had been there. This leave-no-trace approach is meant both as a matter of respect for nature and as a way to reduce local resentment and future conflicts. For nearby villages, the gatherings may even bring some economic benefits when participants buy supplies before or after the event, but the movement generally tries not to impose itself on local life. Fieldwork at Rainbow explains how the author studied the Rainbow gathering by using ethnographic methods, which means observing and participating directly in the daily life of the event rather than standing on the sidelines. Because the gathering prohibits electronic devices, the researcher could not record interviews or take digital notes, so all observations had to be written by hand. This approach allowed the researcher to see how things actually worked on the ground and to understand the rhythms, decisions, and interactions that shaped the gathering from the inside rather than from an external viewpoint. The author also brings a long-standing familiarity with rainbow gatherings and related non-hierarchical movements, which helped in understanding the culture and expectations of the community. This prior experience meant the researcher did not arrive as a complete outsider and could more easily interpret subtle social norms, decision-making habits, and the unspoken rules that guide behavior in the camp. Such background knowledge made it possible to recognize when something was typical, unusual, or significant within the movement's broader history. The fieldwork took place during the 2024 European Rainbow Gathering, where the researcher stayed for 7 weeks, longer than the main event, participating in the lead-up, the peak period, and the clean-up afterwards. This extended stay was important because the gathering is not just the days when the main crowd arrives, it is a process that includes preparing the site, running daily life for thousands of people, and restoring the land afterward. Being present for the entire cycle allowed the author to observe how different phases require different kinds of cooperation and how organizational roles shift over time. The researcher gained access through contacts with experienced Rainbow participants who were already involved in organizing the 2024 gathering. This meant the author was immediately drawn into essential tasks, rather than simply watching others work. Helping with the core activities, such as setting up kitchens, preparing communal spaces, and supporting logistical needs, created opportunities to see how responsibilities emerge, how they are shared, and how people coordinate without formal leadership. Active participation revealed the practical challenges of maintaining a leaderless structure under demanding conditions. The analysis focused on understanding how the gathering manages to sustain horizontal power, meaning how it prevents authority from concentrating in a few hands and instead keeps decision-making shared among participants. By observing talking circles, daily routines, and informal negotiations, the researcher identified the techniques, both social and practical, that allow thousands of people to live together cooperatively. The section shows that the fieldwork was not only about documenting activities but about uncovering the mechanisms that make large-scale non-hierarchical organization possible in real life. General Rules of the Gathering describes the basic rules that shape how a rainbow gathering functions, starting with its timing and overall structure. The European gathering is held each year around the August full moon, giving it a predictable rhythm that participants can plan around. Before the event, invitations circulate informally through the Rainbow Network, outlining the core principles that newcomers must understand before arriving. These guidelines are not treated as strict laws but as shared expectations that make it possible for thousands of people to live together respectfully and cooperatively in a temporary community. The behavioral rules are designed to create a peaceful and focused environment. Alcohol is not allowed in public spaces because it is seen as a major cause of conflict and disruption. Phones, electronic devices, and amplified music are also banned so that people can disconnect from outside distractions and interact face-to-face. Even photography is tightly controlled, taking pictures requires consent, and pointing a camera at someone without asking is considered a serious violation. These norms help everyone feel safer and more present, reinforcing the idea that the gathering is a break from normal life. A central rule of the gathering is that no money changes hands. Participants cannot buy or sell anything, and no one can be paid for their work. This money-free environment removes the usual economic differences that shape everyday interactions and prevents any form of commercialization. Instead, people contribute voluntarily to collective tasks like cooking, building infrastructure, or fetching water. The aim is to make sure that everyone participates as equals and that no one gains influence by owning resources or controlling valuable services. Enforcement of these rules is deliberately non-coercive. There are no security guards, police, or official authority figures. Instead, people take on temporary organizational roles known as focalizers, but these roles are open for anyone to step into and can be questioned or replaced at any time. This system ensures that power does not settle permanently in the hands of a few individuals. It relies heavily on community responsibility. When someone sees something that needs doing, whether it is stirring a pot or resolving a misunderstanding, they are encouraged to act rather than wait for a designated leader. When conflicts occur, they are handled collectively through non-violent intervention. Participants are expected to step in calmly to diffuse tension, often by forming a circle around the situation or gently escorting disruptive individuals away. This creates a sense of shared responsibility for the safety and emotional climate of the gathering. The biggest external conflicts usually happen only when the police attempt to evict the gathering, but even then the movement's stance is to remain non-confrontational and avoid escalation. Overall, the rules in this section demonstrate how the Rainbow Gathering maintains order through shared norms and community action rather than authority or force. Techniques of Nonviolence explains how rainbow gatherings use everyday practices to keep power equal and nonviolent, starting with the decision to remove money from the picture. At the gathering, you cannot pay anyone to do anything, and there are no paid services of any kind. Everything runs on voluntary labor. People decide to cook, dig toilets, carry food, or build structures because they want to help, not because they are being hired. This means there are no customers and no service providers, which cuts off one of the main ways power usually appears in society, where those who can pay control what happens and those who need money must obey. Instead of businesses or fees, the gathering uses what is called the magic hat system to cover shared costs. From time to time, a hat or basket is passed around the main circle, and anyone who can afford it puts in some money. No one is watching, there are no records, and no one knows who gave what. The collected money goes into a common budget managed by temporary volunteers and is spent on essentials like bulk food for communal meals, pipes and containers for the water system, tarps for shelter, and tools needed to keep the camp running. Because contributions are anonymous and spending is openly discussed, it becomes very hard for any person or group to use money to gain status or control. The way work is organized also reflects this nonviolent, horizontal approach. There is no central boss telling people what to do. Instead, individuals or small groups become focalizers when they see a need and step forward to coordinate a specific task. One person might take the lead on the main kitchen, another on water supply, another on building compost toilets, and others on maintaining paths or fire safety. These roles are not permanent titles but practical responses to real needs, and they are open to anyone with the willingness and basic skills to help. Through this model, the gathering shows that large, complex work can be organized through cooperation and initiative rather than orders. Daily life is held together by a clear rhythm that centers on 2 communal vegan meals each day. At mealtimes, people gather in a large circle, sit down together, and are served food from big pots, following simple hygiene rules. Once everyone is settled, the circle becomes the main news channel of the gathering. People call out announcements about workshops, music jams, talking circles, or practical needs like help carrying food or fixing the water line. Anyone can stand up and propose an activity or ask for support. This open program means that the cultural and social life of the camp is created from the bottom up, reflecting whatever participants are willing to share. The physical layout of the gathering also supports non-hierarchical, non-violent relations through a network of semi-autonomous camps. Across the site, groups of people set up their own cooking fires, tarps, and sleeping areas, sometimes around shared language, region, or interests, and sometimes just by chance. Many of these camps have their own small kitchens and social spaces, and they often share tools, pots, and materials that belong to local rainbow groups. Participants come from many countries and speak many languages, with English usually acting as the bridge, so the site becomes a patchwork of overlapping communities rather than a single centralized village controlled from the top. The movement also consciously chooses to stay offline as a way to avoid new forms of power. There is a shared agreement that Rainbow should not be officially represented on social media, and anyone running online groups or channels is acting only in a personal capacity. This is meant to prevent a situation where the administrators of a Facebook group or a Telegram channel become gatekeepers or unofficial leaders simply because they control information. By insisting that all real decisions and discussions happen face-to-face at the gathering, Rainbow keeps authority rooted in the people who are physically present and participating, rather than in distant digital moderators. Decision-making follows the same logic of openness and slowness. Important issues are discussed in circles where anyone at the gathering can join, with people speaking one at a time using a talking stick or similar object that is passed around. The process is deliberately slow, and reaching consensus means that the stick can go all the way around the circle in silence, showing that no one present strongly objects. One of the most important uses of this method is the Vision Council, a series of long meetings where participants decide which country and general area will host the next European gathering. Because this can take days of listening and negotiation, it filters out quick power grabs and pushes people to stay engaged and respectful. Finally, the section explains how these techniques fit into an annual cycle that has been repeating since the early 1980s. Once a location is agreed, a scouting group spends months looking for suitable sites and building connections with local rainbow circles. Shared equipment such as large cooking pots, water pipes, tarps, and tools is stored and then moved from one gathering to the next in vans and trailers. This ongoing cycle of scouting, preparing, gathering, and moving on shows that the non-violent, non-hierarchical model is not a one-off experiment but a long-term practice that has kept the movement alive for decades across different countries and changing political conditions. The discussion section explains that rainbow gatherings are an example of prefigurative politics, meaning they try to live the change they want to see rather than just asking governments to make that change. Because the gatherings have no leaders, no formal organization, and no one who can legally represent or take responsibility for the whole group, they do not fit well into legal systems that expect clear hierarchies and accountable representatives. In this way, Rainbow is similar to squatting movements and other free spaces that exist in legal gray zones, where their very form of organization clashes with official expectations. The author emphasizes that, in Rainbow, politics happens through daily routines rather than through public speeches or media campaigns. Every shared meal, every voluntary task, and every non-violent response to conflict is part of a quiet political practice that tests whether people can live together without bosses or money-based power. This makes the movement much less visible than high-profile protests or occupations that attract cameras and headlines, but it does not make it less political. Instead, its importance lies in how ordinary acts of cooperation add up to a different way of organizing life. Rainbow is described as a kind of politics that does not issue demands or petitions to the state. Participants are not there to lobby governments, pass laws, or win policy changes. They are there to build and experience a small, temporary society based on non-command and non-obedience. In other words, the point is not to reform existing institutions but to show, in practice, that people can organize themselves in other ways. This internal logic shapes how rules are made, how conflicts are handled, and how responsibilities are shared, all without relying on the usual top-down structures. The section also highlights Rainbow as an example of institutional flexibility, the human ability to move between different social arrangements and to take hierarchies apart when needed. By regularly creating and dismantling these temporary communities, the movement demonstrates that fixed structures of power are not inevitable. The techniques it uses, like consensus decision-making, shared resources, and rotating roles, make it possible to keep building alternative spaces again and again, even under changing conditions. This repeated practice helps keep the idea of non-hierarchical organization alive and concrete, not just theoretical. Finally, the author argues that Rainbow's influence reaches beyond the gatherings themselves. Many participants are involved in other social movements, and they carry Rainbow's methods, such as non-violent conflict handling, horizontal decision-making, and money-free cooperation, into different activist spaces. In this way, prefiguration works as a form of education for the imagination. By having lived through a functioning, if temporary, alternative, people find it easier to believe that other, more just forms of society are possible and to experiment with them elsewhere. The conclusion explains that rainbow gatherings have become a long-standing part of Europe's alternative movement landscape, continuing for more than 4 decades. Their endurance shows that it is possible to maintain a large, recurring, non-hierarchical community across different countries and political contexts. Rather than being a temporary trend, Rainbow has developed into a stable tradition that consistently recreates its core values year after year. A major reason for this longevity is the set of techniques the movement uses to prevent power from concentrating in the hands of a few people. By avoiding official leadership roles, relying on consensus, and allowing responsibilities to shift constantly, the gatherings preserve their autonomy and resist becoming formalized organizations. These methods act as safeguards that keep the community from drifting into hierarchy, even as it grows or faces outside pressure. The conclusion also highlights how central voluntary participation is to the movement's functioning. Because the gatherings operate offline, without phones or social media, and because no money changes hands, all activities depend on people choosing to contribute. This creates a social environment where cooperation is based on shared commitment rather than obligation or payment. The money-free and offline structure reinforces the idea that equality and trust, not economic or digital influence, should shape interactions. Another factor behind Rainbow's continued success is its mobility. Moving from country to country makes it harder for authorities to shut the gatherings down permanently and helps avoid accumulated local tension. Over time, participants have developed a great deal of practical know-how about how to set up kitchens, water systems, shelters, and decision-making spaces in remote areas. This expertise, passed informally from one generation of participants to the next, allows the movement to rebuild itself smoothly in new locations. Finally, the section argues that Rainbow deserves more attention from researchers. Despite its longevity, scale, and influence on broader activist practices, it has received little academic study, especially in Europe. The author suggests that understanding Rainbow's organizational strategies could offer valuable insights into how non-hierarchical communities work, how power can be shared effectively, and how alternative social arrangements can be created and maintained over long periods. The 2024 European Rainbow Gathering in Germany unfolded deep in the mountains, in a place deliberately chosen for its remoteness and its weak spots, the kind of terrain where approaching with police vehicles would be difficult and costly. The researcher arrived a week before the official beginning, traveling with experienced organizers who had been part of the small group that invited the movement to Germany. Arriving early meant entering a nearly empty landscape, a forest and meadow zone that had not yet transformed into the vast, temporary city it would soon become. The early crew began clearing spaces, identifying where water could be drawn, marking the main meadow for the central food circle, and planning where camps might later spring up. There were no electronic devices, no network, no digital planning, everything relied on conversations and shared memory. The first days were quiet, filled with the sounds of tools, discussions around small fires, and the slow rhythm of building an encampment from nothing. The researcher took handwritten notes because phones and recording devices were not permitted out of respect for the terrain. As more people arrived, the gathering blossomed into a place representing over 50 nationalities. Camps appeared everywhere, tucked into forests and meadows, each with its own fireplace, tarps for shelter, and simple food and drink shared among neighbors. Some were national camps, French, Italian, and others, using familiar tools, teepees, tarps, and equipment that circulate through the movement from year to year. Others formed randomly by chance, sometimes miles from the main meadow. These clusters created coffee mountains, music temples, chill-out zones, and spontaneous meeting areas that became the social fabric of daily life. English served as the bridge language, but dozens of others were heard around fires late at night. Some people lived close to the main circle, others preferred long walks and greater solitude, appearing only occasionally for meals or gatherings. The shape of the zone was never planned, it emerged organically from how people chose to place themselves. At its peak, the gathering swelled into a busy, living world built entirely on voluntary labor. There were no paid workers and no service hierarchies. Kitchens ran because someone decided to chop vegetables. Water systems flowed because someone took responsibility for laying pipes. Compost toilets functioned because a group spontaneously focalized the task. The same people who stirred giant communal pots during the day might be building shelters, teaching workshops, or joining music circles at night. Every evening brought singing sessions and open musical events where anyone could participate, reinforcing a culture built on creativity rather than performance. The full moon celebration, the emotional high point of the gathering, was nothing more than a giant fire around which participants created the night's atmosphere through their own energy, songs, dances, and gestures. Nothing was scheduled, nothing was organized by a central authority, the evening simply unfolded according to what people brought to it. By day, life revolved around 2 vegan meals served in the main circle. Thousands would sit on the grass, forming a ring around the meadow while food was carried from the kitchens in large pots. After eating, the circle became the center of communication. Announcements were made about workshops, tasks that needed help, missing people, lost items, upcoming talking circles, or news about the police. Anyone could stand and speak. It was also here that the magic hat was passed around, anonymously collecting money for food and infrastructure. A child, a barefoot wanderer, or an elder might carry the hat. The point was never who gave but that the gathering could continue. In this way the circle anchored the daily rhythm of thousands of people who had temporarily stepped outside of the ordinary world. The 2024 gathering in Germany experienced significant confusion over online misinformation, because some people arrived with expectations formed by Telegram posts that did not match reality on the ground. The movement reaffirmed, by consensus, that rainbow does not exist on social media. As events intensified, particularly during several police eviction attempts involving hundreds of officers, the offline rule created 2 parallel realities, the one in the meadow, and the distorted digital interpretations circulating outside. Participants stuck to the principle that decisions can only be made by those physically present. The police arrived multiple times, deploying forces with the intention of shutting the gathering down, but the steep mountain terrain and the movement's non-violent, non-confrontational approach made eviction difficult. People simply stayed calm, avoided escalation, and maintained the tone of peaceful presence even under pressure. After the full moon, the Vision Council began, days of slow consensus building where anyone could sit in a circle, hold the talking stick, and help choose the next year's location. It took place almost like a long meditation, unfolding under the sky with people listening, waiting, debating, and holding silence when agreement was reached. Meanwhile, everyday life continued. Children played in the camps, musicians wandered with hand drums, people rested in hammocks strung between trees, and tea fires burned throughout the forest. Workshops happened spontaneously. Someone might call out yoga, meditation, knitting, conflict resolution, or singing circles. Others focused purely on practical work, repairing cracks in water lines, reinforcing cooking shelters, or reorganizing supply storage. When the gathering finally began to disperse, another story took shape: the cleanup. Groups formed to close fire pits, take down structures, pick up every scrap of rubbish, and restore grass and soil. This was treated as a serious responsibility. The goal was always the same: to leave the land as if no one had ever been there. The researcher, who had been present since the earliest preparations, stayed after the main crowds were gone, helping return the site to its original state. The final days were quiet, mirroring the early days before the gathering started, smoke drifting from the last small fires, scattered clusters of people folding tarps, and long conversations about memories of the month.